Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I can see that our attendee list is jumping up by the tens every second. So I'm going to do a very slow, ambling intro, and then I'm going to hand over to our first keynote. Welcome, everyone, to Engage 2023. Today, we've got more than 12 sessions. We've got more than 20 speakers, and you can get involved in the conversation online, whether it be Twitter or LinkedIn, using the hashtag #PopuloEngage23. I'll see you all there. I'm Andrew Hubbard. I'm the Director of Internal Communications and Engagement here at Populo, and it's my pleasure to kick us off today. And we're delighted to be joined at Engage by Ghassan Karian, who is the founder and CEO of Ipsos Karian and Box. And Ghassan's going to walk us through their 2023 IC report, which considers the employee's perspective. And I've had a look through these results. I've been blessed to have a bit of an early view of them, and I've got to say they're fascinating. So there's going to be time at the end of this session for Q&A, and I'll be walking through your questions. So feel free to head to the Q&A section here on Zoom, ask the questions as they come up. At the end of the session, I'll pitch as many of them as I can to Ghassan. But without further ado, let's kick off. Ghassan, let me hand over to you. Tell us all about it.
Andrew, thank you, and thank you, David, for that introduction earlier. So, IC Index 2023 came about a few months ago because Karian and Box, the business that I've led and founded 16 years ago, we conduct research with over half the FTSE 100 in the UK, but also businesses in the US, Switzerland, Israel, Australia, globally. And we've picked up a number of very interesting trends on how employees want to be communicated with, what their experience of it is. Too often we see communication studies that are from the perspective of the communicator and not enough from the audiences themselves. And so what we decided to do was conduct a truly representative study, a first of its kind. It's the largest study of its kind in the United Kingdom. Now, what's really interesting is many of the trends that we're seeing in this study, which is a representative study of 3,000 employees across the United Kingdom, and it's a fully representative, stratified and weighted sample of the UK workforce. It reflects many of the trends we've seen over the last year or two, both in the UK and, broadly speaking, reflects some of the key trends we're seeing in places like Germany, the US, and many others. So let me dive straight into the results. As I said, it's a sample of 3,000 employees, and it's been weighted to make sure it's representative by sector, by gender, by age. And what it does is give us a truly distinct view of what employees say, feel, and want. And I think one of the key things is that there is a lot of data behind this. The report itself is 68 pages long, so it's an incredibly meaty and weighty document with lots of rich insights around broad trends, but also about specific trends by, as I've said, sector, age, and so on. And we will be issuing this report in early July. So please watch out for it, and we will make sure that via Populo you have direct access to it as a first starting point. So the first thing to say is we asked the question whether people experience internal communications, whether they have internal communications teams, and on the whole you have a really good set of feedback around people's experience of internal communications. Those who feel they have internal communications, internal communication teams are much more positive about the internal communications from their organizations than those that don't. But overall, 6 out of 10 would say that the communications from their employer are excellent. Under 1 in 10 experience very poor communications, and just under a third are more ambivalent. And what's really interesting is when you look at that score by sector, by different demographic populations, and then also by the inputs that drive that, the scores change very radically. And so there are some really interesting differences. But overall, the communications profession is doing a good job There is room for improvement, but there's certainly a solid starting base in terms of the experience that the workforces out there in the UK have. And communications does make a difference. So we looked at a number of what we would call filtering questions, things like, are employees engaged? Do they plan to leave their employers anytime soon? Do they trust what their CEO is saying? And the question itself on how people rate the communications from their employer. And what you can see is those teams, those employees rather, that have who say that their employer has a dedicated IC team are much more positive about communications than those that aren't, as I reflected on earlier, but also a lot more engaged, are less likely to say they plan to leave the organization that they work for in under 2 years, and are more trusting of their CEO and what that CEO is saying. Clearly, communications has a role to play. There are other factors at play, of course, on things like engagement and attrition. But communications is an important foundation in creating the right environment for people to experience an employer that is one that they feel engaged in. And what drives communication? We looked at a range of metrics, and there are 3 key measures that influence communication measures that influence whether people are advocates for their employer, whether they say that their organization is a great place to work. Now, as I said, there are other measures that aren't to do with communication that we looked at. But in particular, we looked at, for this study, the communication measures that have the biggest influence on advocacy. They are whether or not their employer encourages and creates an environment where people are able to have two-way conversation and feel involved. They're employees who feel that they're being told a very frank and open story about their organization, about its priorities, about how it's doing. And that they're people who subscribe to, who believe in the strategy. And there are factors that drive those themselves: the trust in the CEO, the connection to the organization's values, feeling that the organization actually listens to them, and having clarity about their business priorities, all influence one or more of those key drivers of advocacy. So communication does have a role to play, does make a difference, and there are some very practical things that businesses, that organizations can do from a communications perspective to influence the advocacy of their workforce. We looked at the data and we segmented the multiple questions so that we got a better sense of the type of personas, the type of workforce groups out there, whether or not you have those individuals that constitute 2 in 5 of the workforce who are informed cheerleaders, who are both motivated, engaged, but also feel informed, feel that communication is clear and trustworthy, but also are critically are ones that value interactive face-to-face communication. Through to the unconvinced cynics, that they believe their organization is communicating well. They rely on emails heavily, but they still don't trust the messages. So what we've done is we've looked at the organizations out there and identified 4 main clusters of employees based on the personas from the way that the questions have landed in terms of people's answers to them. We've also looked at whether or not what employers are talking about in terms of their priorities, their strategy. 6 out of 10, 63%, say that they believe the strategy is the right one. But interestingly, fewer of them have clarity on what that strategy is. And there's interestingly a proportion of the population that you would call ones who have that strength of understanding, but that they don't believe, the disconnected population. But you also have a population who are much further along in their belief, and they're not that interested in the detail. What's fascinating is that there is a proportion of the population amongst the senior leaders who are much higher in their belief in the strategy than they are in their actual belief that employers that their employer has been clear on the strategy. And so there's a job to do for leaders themselves to believe that their employer is doing a good job on communicating strategy, and that's very clear from the data. We asked the question, how much time do employees spend looking at communications from their employer? 1 in 4 said none or hardly any time. And 43% said they spend up to 15 minutes a day, which actually is not bad. If you add that up, that's just over 2 and a bit hours. No, just over an hour, sorry, my maths. That says a lot there about the accessibility of communications that you have, and whether or not you are providing people with 3-course meal communications or snackable information that people can dip in and out of. And that's important, because a lot of time and effort is produced by communicators into big, long, detailed communications that often don't get read because people just don't have the time. And the 3 most popular mechanisms by which people see or read or hear about their organization are either part of the team meeting, in between team meetings, or indeed about 1 in 6 review communications from their employer about their employer before they even start working. A very small proportion do so just as they wake up, and as you can imagine, more of those are senior. What do employees want to know about? There is a clear ask for more about pay and benefits. That's not surprising. We see that with all our clients. We see that quite heavily. The 2 that are really interesting are the very heavy proportion who want far more from their employer about the organization's strategy and direction, but also about their own role in that and how they can build their career in the organization. And those 2, critically, are highly impactful on engagement. So when employees receive too little about strategy and direction and too little about career development, it drives down engagement. Interestingly, so those 3 items are ones, but in particular strategy and direction, which often is in the preserve of communication professionals, those are areas to upweight communication. Very interestingly, a very polarizing set of feedback around what you could call some of the more intangible components of the organization's stated mission and purpose, its values and culture, but also its DEI agenda. There is a high proportion who say they don't receive enough. More of those are younger, under 30, but there's also very high proportions who say they receive too much. And that again is interesting when you look at that data by sector geography. But clearly, there is a real distinct difference in people's perspectives about those 3 topics. We asked the question how often they spend time seeing their CEO, but also other leaders. I'm just focusing in on the CEO question here. And the bar chart at the bottom there shows you the proportion of employees who say they see their CEO daily through to rarely, if at all. And interestingly, again, there's a polarization there. 1 in 10 say they see their leader every few days. That is heavily weighted to organizations of between 500 to 1,000 people. And then at the other end of the spectrum, 1 in 10 say they rarely, if ever, see their CEO. And the mix of proportions of time spent experiencing communication from their CEO differs from weekly through to once a year. What's really interesting as well is the direct connection between the proportion who say they see their leader at different stages and levels of engagement. As you can see, those who see their leader every day through to every week, our engagement levels are up in the 60s, 61 to 69%, through to those employees who say they see their leader rarely, if at all. Engagement is half of that, is at 30%. And therefore, again, what we can see here is the critical role communications plays in leaders being out there communicating where the organization is going, what it's doing, and also the way leaders communicate. One of the things that this data shows is that the way leaders communicate is important, because those face-to-face opportunities are much more likely to drive even higher engagement than simply having emails, newsletters, or internet articles from the CEO. People do want to see communications from their leader via email. It's one of the most popular mechanisms, and it's a very functional and very useful way in which organizations get information out there to employees, and it's one that both employees want and experience to broadly equal measures, both from the CEO but also from departmental leaders and senior managers. What's really interesting is where employees want information far more on a face-to-face basis is communications from their departmental head or senior managers, and that interactive discussion with senior leaders in their part of the business is a greater ask for face-to-face interaction, and that's critical. Managers matter, and they are ones that individuals trust, irrespective of organizational size. But a high proportion of them, nearly a third, don't feel equipped to support conversations with their team. So 65% do feel equipped, but 1 in 3 of the workforce say they don't feel equipped. And what they simply want, many of them, when we ask them the question, well, what is it you need? And again, there's a lot more detail behind this. These are the very top level findings, is they want more information about what to communicate, and they want clarity. And I think there is a lot there that the data shows about how you can equip and educate managers on how to have those kind of conversations, both in terms of the content, the substance you give them, but also in terms of the tools that they want and require. And critically, there's a real hunger to be heard, to be listened to. 54% of the workforce in the UK say that their organisation welcomes open feedback, but only 45% say that that organisation is good at acting on feedback, showing how it's acting on feedback. And what you can see there is a clear difference between those employers who say their employer welcomes feedback and acts on it, versus those employees who say their employer welcomes feedback but is not seen to act on it. And you can see there's a huge gap there in perceptions on whether or not their employer has clearly communicated the organizational goals, whether or not the employer levels of advocacy in terms of whether or not their employer is seen to be a great place to work, or indeed levels of engagement. And in each of those cases and on other metrics, those employers who not only welcome feedback, but are then going back to employees and communicating how they've acted on the feedback is a critical differentiator in terms of driving engagement. Conscious of time, there are, as I said right at the outset and throughout, the report is very rich, very detailed. I've spent literally no more than 10 or so minutes giving you the headlines of that, and in 2 to 3 weeks' time, we issue the full detailed report. In summary, I wanted to just reflect on having been a head of internal and direct internal comms in-house for a number of years. If I was in-house, what would I take away from the data? The first is the importance of demonstrating the impact, showing the evidence to our stakeholders, not critically, not just where we're doing well, but also where communication isn't working, where we need to take learnings from the data, from the insight that we gather as professional communicators who listen to our own workforce and help educate leaders on what does work, but do so in a way that's data-led. The second is being very clear about the type of audience and the segmentation of the workforce in a way that allows you to tailor and target communications. BP did this amazingly well last year in communicating strategy by using a segmented approach and then using that approach to create personas that enabled a targeted approach to both the mechanisms, the channels, but also the messaging on a site-by-site basis. The ability for you to help the organization focus on what's driving the changes that you may be undertaking, to understand the context of the market, the operational context in which you're helping them understand the strategy, the priorities, but also just being really clear about where it is the organization's headed and how you'll get there, because there's a real hunger for more detail on that. And potentially, because many organizations have dialed up over years to focus on purpose, vision, and values, which are seen as intangible, there's a greater hunger for the more tangible. And that tangibility needs to feel real, needs to feel honest and frank and reflective of their day-to-day experience. It needs to be short, it needs to be snackable information, not three-course meals, because people simply do not have the time. It needs to be in their language. And a concept I've used for many years is, as someone who wears glasses, when you put on a new pair of glasses, they're automatically visible to you at the end of your nose. If you put a piece of blue tack, you know what that is, at the end of your nose, it's visible. But within seconds, it becomes invisible because your psychology, your brain learns to scan it out. And we as professional communicators need to put blue tacks at the end of all our workforce's nose, because we need to capture their attention. We need to show them something different so that they notice it. Otherwise, a lot of the stuff we do on the internet and in the campaigns that we all run becomes invisible because it becomes too familiar. And finally, we need to differentiate the need versus the channel. We know that functional channels like email, like workplace, and other online channels have a fundamental role to play in how you communicate with the workforce, how you inform them, how you get information out there that is critical to people's jobs. But what it doesn't do, what it can't do, is create the human-to-human connection that is critical to building trust and engagement. And that comes through, as the data shows again and again, from having interaction between leaders and their people, and leaders at every level, from your direct manager through to the CEO, because having that interaction builds trust, builds engagement. And those are the 5 things that I think on a very quick basis, I took away from the data and I would apply if I was in-house once again. But I strongly recommend that you have a look at the data, you have a look at the report, and come to your own conclusions about what's most relevant to your own organization, the challenges you face, and the strategic route that you take to help engage a workforce by fundamentally helping them be better informed and communicated with and listened to.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ghassan. We've got quite a few questions coming in, and I found that really interesting as a communicator. I think the note on 15 minutes to engage people really hit home. That's an age-old challenge, isn't it? Let's move to Q&A because I'm conscious of time. There's lots of other sessions today. Let's look firstly then at some of the questions that came in that we've answered, but just to give you a summary, firstly, the on-demand sessions of today, today's Engage presentations will be shared after the event. They will include slides. And as Ghassan said, there will be all Engage attendees will get a copy of the Ipsos Karian and Box IC report, which is a fantastic perk for a free conference because we all like data, don't we? But there are a lot of questions on the data. So let me first ask you this, Ghassan. Let's look at the data set. We've had some questions around what was the sample size, what were the org types, the smallest to the largest company size band, what were the geographies? Give us a bit of insight there.
Okay, so the geography was only UK. The sample size is we took organizations of 500 who employed employees of 500 or more, because of course, if you're looking at internal communications, many organizations only have internal communications functions are over a particular size. So we looked at employers who had 500 employees or more, and these included employers who had tens of thousands of employees. We then segmented the data by, as I said, by gender, by age, and critically, we reweighted the data so it reflected the actual UK workforce, excluding those who work for employers that employ fewer than 500 employees. So it's people in the workforce working for organisations over 500 size.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. Thank you. That answers quite a few questions as well. One follow up then, was it, did it target deskless employees as well as those who were kind of connected? Yeah.
Yes, it looked at employees because we conducted as Ipsos a representative sample of the workforce who have access and who participate in panels. So these are employees who will be store workers, who will be retail outlet workers, who will be working in factories, who sign up to participate in surveys, and therefore it's not like when you conduct a survey with your own workforce and you're targeting them. We have a panel of millions of employees, and we go to we go to employees who fulfill particular criteria in terms of sector, blue collar, white collar, and so on.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So I guess the natural question then is, if primarily the data, in fact, the data set was UK based, as you say, how would you say the data translates to the global picture? We've had questions saying, would this translate to the US market? Would it translate to the Spanish market based on data that you've seen? How would it translate, if at all?
I think some of the fundamentals of how people behave and think in terms of the impact of frequency of communication, some of the behavioral aspects will be the same. So having visibility, I've seen in the US, in China, in India, in Australia, absolutely the same connections between frequency of contact with your CEO and trust and engagement, about listening and the impact that has. I've seen people's desire to see more and hear more about strategy and about business priorities. Now, are we talking about the same levels from the same baselines in terms of the proportions who currently use email and or experience leaders communicating at differential times? That will differ by country, by sector, by region within the UK. So it's not that the data itself on an objective basis will be the same in the US as the UK, but the connections in terms of what's driving what are the same. And we see that across our multiple data sets, because we conduct research for the likes of BP, HSBC, Barclays, Diageo, Philip Morris, who have global representation. We see many of the same trends, but just at different levels.
No, absolutely. That's really helpful. Thank you. A couple of quick fire ones. One on what tool did you use for the data collection, and a follow-up. What tool did you use for the data collection? I imagine it's your own in-house platform.
We have, so Ipsos has its own panels of, as I said, millions of employees, and we run research.
Brilliant. And is there everyone here is going to get a copy of the report. Does the report include a breakdown by industry?
It breaks down the demography at the back of the report in the methodology page on how many in the survey participated by demography, so by gender, by sector. Yes.
Fantastic. That's great. Okay, so we've got a couple minutes for a couple more questions. So we had one here on when is the best time to communicate. So there was a question here around, does the research have any insight as to what day of the week is most effective to get engagement? Because this colleague's saying historically Fridays weren't supposed to be good, but actually is that outdated? Because now they're seeing evidence that people are more receptive to certain types of communications on Fridays. Was there anything in this report, or indeed have you seen anything else that kind of says Wednesday's the best day or Friday's a fair game now?
I think it's so localized in terms of the nature of the operation that each organization has. So if you're a retailer, if you're busy on a Saturday and a Sunday, versus if you're a manufacturing organization, versus if you're a white collar environment, does knowledge work of 5 days, Monday to Friday, If you're in countries that have, like in the Middle East, that close on a Friday but open on a Sunday. So I think this is an international audience, and therefore to say it's a Tuesday. So I, in the UK, used to always think about the best data, and it was borne out by the data. Tuesday was the best day to hit people with new news, right? Because Monday people come back into the office. Friday, their mind is beginning to switch off. But that was in a UK context, in a white collar work environment. Very different if you've got people who are shift workers. So I think that question is a very difficult one to ask in a survey of this kind that is looking at multiple sectors. And when you overlay that with multiple geographies and multiple sectors, I would urge each organization to think about its own audience and its own work patterns and its own data. I guarantee you will have data about who's clocking on and off, at what points, who's going online, going offline, who's accessing information, and you then make the judgment about when to play it in.
I can see we're starting to lose people to other sessions, so I'm going to ask you one more quick fire question before giving you a big thank you, sir. What surprised you most about the results in this survey?
Andrew, you're too quiet.
Apologies. But what surprised you most?
This is going to be a hot. So what surprised me the most was the proportion of employees who rated the internal communications of their organizations excellent. It surprised me in a pleasant way.
In a pleasant way. Pleasantly surprised.
Yes.
Love that. We've got a few laughing emojis on that one. Listen, really huge thank you for kicking off the sessions for us today. Can't wait to see the report, and looking forward to staying in touch in the future. Thank you so much, and we'll let you guys head off and join other sessions. Thank you, everyone.
Likewise. Bye-bye.